Dan Moulthrop spent his formative high school years in New Jersey, traversed the country to Berkeley, California, and then wisely landed in the Midwest in Cleveland, Ohio, although I think there was a special magnetic pull that got him here. He's co-founder of the Civic Commons, worked previously as a print and radio journalist, including as host of WCPN's Sound of Ideas. He's an author, co-editor of A Race Anthology, Dispatches and Artifacts from a Segregated City, and co-author of Teachers Have It Easy, The Big Sacrifices and Small Salaries of America's Teachers. He wrote that with great knowledge because he was a high school teacher. Both of those books, the topics, the themes they're in, are critically important with everything that we're facing today. I think that Dan at his core is and always will be a teacher because he educates all of Northeast Ohio weekly through his City Club forums. He's a recipient of the 2019 Cleveland Jewish News Civic Leadership Award, a noted member of the Power 100, among others. And as he himself says, he executes daily on the act of curiosity. He loves the clashing of ideas. He is a proud member of the Leadership Cleveland class of 2014, and he is here to educate us today on the act of civic discourse. Dan?
Thank you so much, Marianne. I honestly don't remember saying that about executing daily on the act of curiosity, but I'm sure there's a lot of things I don't remember saying. In fact, I probably won't remember this as soon as it's over. But I want to thank all of you for being here today. Thank you to the Leadership Center for the invitation to come and speak as part of the series. I was surprised when Rachel Marianne reached out because I don't know. I mean, you never, like, it takes a while to come to think of yourself in these terms as somebody that you know, several dozen people will want to hear from. And no matter how many times I'm invited to speak somewhere, I inevitably feel like, really? You want to really me? Are you sure? Is someone else not available? So I'm sure that's the case. Somebody else wasn't available, but here I am, and we'll make the best of it. I want to talk to you. Rachel and her colleagues asked me to talk to you today about having difficult conversations and civil discourse in uncivil times. And I want to anchor my comments actually in things that I have learned from other people and some things that I've picked up along the way. I just noticed, I'm sorry, this is a total sidebar, but I just noticed that Bruce Akers joined with the video, and Bruce Akers introduced Ronald Reagan in 1988 at the City Club of Cleveland, and that video is now available on our website. And at this point in time, when you are thirsting for some real democracy, it just might make you cry to watch it. And it did. It got a little dusty in here in my home office when I was watching it the other day. So big shout out to Bruce Akers. Mayor Akers, thank you for joining us today. And really thanks to everybody. There's a lot of familiar faces at Judson and elsewhere around our community. So when I think about what's important, and I had kind of said this out the other day on Twitter when the Leadership Center tagged me, I said, you know, like, spoiler alert or something, like this whole thing is going to boil down to listen more. And it really does, but I want to kind of break that open a little bit. And there's a few things I want to share with you. I'm going to share my screen briefly here so that you can, just to make it a little less about me. I'm having some trouble with this naturally, because one does as soon as one starts this stuff. Okay. So Brian Stevenson. Brian Stevenson is the author of a book called Just Mercy. He spoke at a City Club of Cleveland event that we hosted at Cleveland State University in partnership with Facing History and ourselves on March 19th, 2015. That was the day after President Obama spoke at a City Club event, and that week almost killed the entire staff of the City Club. But Brian Stevenson is incredible. Those of you who have read Just Mercy know this. And his talk, and he gives this sort of talk in a lot of places, it boils down to basically 4 rules. Number one, get proximate. 2, change the narrative. 3, stay hopeful. And the 4th is about getting comfortable being uncomfortable. So I just want to talk about those things. And then I'm actually going to share my screen again in a little bit if I can. Well, actually, I'll do this real quick because I'm having so much trouble with my mouse right now. The other person I want to talk about, and I'll share this and then I'll get back to just being on the screen. Eric Liu runs an organization called Citizen University, and he's based in Seattle. And he had, I saw him speak, and this is an Instagram post that I shared a couple of years ago about his rules for better arguments. And these ideas that they're very concrete, a little more concrete than Brian Stevenson's, and I love them. Take winning off the table, prioritize relationships, and listen passionately. You can see that I was taking notes quickly, and I lost the Y on passionately. Pay attention to context, embrace vulnerability, and be willing to have your mind changed, which is one of my favorites. So I'm just going to stop sharing the screen for a second and talk about all of this stuff. This idea, to go back to Brian Stevenson for a second and his first rule about getting proximate. We talk about wanting to make change in the community, wanting to repair race relations or dismantle systemic racism and white supremacy. And we talk about these things a lot, but we have to get proximate. We have to get close to these issues. In my life, over the course of my, of my professional career, I hadn't really realized that was sort of what I was doing. When I worked in a county jail before I taught high school, when I was doing nonprofit work in New York City, when I was teaching high school, that was all about kind of getting close to the kinds of challenges that I sought to help communities overcome. And I think it is also, you can think about it in the professional context, you can think about it in the institutional context. I think the Leadership Center and through the Leadership Center programs, whether it's Bridge Builders or Look Up or Leadership Cleveland, one of the real values that, or the value propositions that that the Leadership Center brings is it allows you to get proximate with a big cohort of people to the issues and to the neighborhoods and to the places. So you have to physically move yourself at times. And it's also on the personal level, getting proximate is about building friendships and relationships and learning how to rely on one another to really understand the nature of the change that we're trying to make. In terms of changing the narrative, which was another one of Brian Stevenson's his points, he makes these points very eloquently. But I think when you think about how to apply that to your own life and the world we're in right now, there is this there's this sense of despair, and and that's sort of the next one too, about staying hopeful. There's this tension between despair and hope. And I don't know 100% of you, but any of you who I've spoken to recently, inevitably our conversation kind of touches on that tension between despair and hope that we're all carrying with us, whether it's about the pandemic, whether it's about racism and dismantling structural racism, and whether or not America will one day become America, the America we believe it should be, whether our community can become the community we aspire for it, that will be, manifest all the aspirations we have for it. But there are ways to change the narrative. I think that the work that I was invited to help lead with Cleveland Rising, I think was a really good example of changing the narrative. There had been this longstanding narrative in Cleveland that things happen, decisions are only made in back rooms and things like that. And today, what we were trying to do with Cleveland Rising is create a new story for Cleveland, one in which more people were participating in creating the changes they want to see. The last one that Brian Stevenson talks about is about getting uncomfortable. And I I think that allowing yourself to be uncomfortable and getting and this is connected as well to Eric Liu's idea of embracing vulnerability. I can't think of anything more important in all of this. The nature of the kinds of conversations that we must have in order to preserve democracy and strengthen democracy, in order to make sure the democracy we create in the future is truly inclusive. These conversations require us to confront the worst parts of our history, of our collective history, the racism that is at the founding of our nation. And they force us to confront the racism and implicit biases that we all carry with us all the time. Part of the message that I want to impart to all of you is that if we're in this moment, right, where you're either choosing anti-racism or you're okay with the status quo. And that's the choice in front of us. And if you're choosing anti-racism, then the work is going to make you uncomfortable, regardless of your racial background. It's going to be tough. And you have to be okay with that. You have to be willing to say, this is going to be uncomfortable. I'm going to have to make myself vulnerable. I may make mistakes, and I'm going to continue to do the work. By the way, that phrase, do the work, is, it bugs me so much sometimes, and I want to talk about that. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. I wanted to come back to Eric Liu's ideas too. Taking winning off the table is one of my favorites. When I have family members who are very close to me, very dear to me, with whom I passionately disagree on political issues. And I lose my mind. I feel like I'm going to lose my mind sometimes when I talk to them. Like my head's really going to explode. What I try to remind myself though, is that there's no winning the argument. There's no it's very hard to change someone else's mind. And in fact, to Eric Liu's final point, it may be easier to be willing to have your own mind changed. Quick story, when we first started, it seems like so long ago, but it was only maybe 6 weeks ago, when George Floyd was killed by police, and the phrase defund the police started to enter mainstream conversation. And it was a few weeks prior to that somebody, a community member, a city club member, had tweeted at me like, hey, you need to have an abolitionist on the city club. I'm like, what? I didn't even know what what an abolitionist, what that referred to. And when we started having these conversations, like defund the police, abolish the police, I was like, how could you do that? You can't, you need the police. They do all sorts of stuff. And over the course of the last of the ensuing 4 weeks, really, I had my mind completely changed on that and really began to understand what defunding the police actually means. And that it's not about removing all forces devoted to public safety, but in fact, just reimagining them. And I don't, in my position, I try not to advocate for one thing or another, but as an engaged citizen who loves to exercise my rights at the ballot box, and is charged with convening conversations around all sorts of issues, I wind up having opinions about things. But I had my mind, opened on that. And as Mordecai Cargill reminded me on the air, if you free your mind and your behind will follow, which is, he didn't write that. That was from Parliament Funkadelic. So taking winning off the table, you don't have to be right all the time. You don't have to be right ever. And anybody who is in a successful marriage knows that. And you can take that lesson from your own closest personal relationships and apply it to these conversations that we have around politics and civics and understand that while your idea may be super important to you, it doesn't have to win, right? Your idea doesn't have to win. Years ago, I was reminded by Facebook, the best part about Facebook, I think, is the memories that pop up. And this morning I was greeted with a picture of me and my colleague Noelle Celeste when we were starting Civic Commons, unpacking a bunch of boxes from IKEA so we could set up our office for Civic Commons, this little like civic tech startup. And when we created Civic Commons, when you create an account for participants, you would sign off on a set of values, one of which was civility. And we defined civility as being more interested in others' opinions than you are in your own, being more interested in understanding the opinions of others than you are in articulating your own, which is a really interesting way, just another way, again, to say, listen more. So I understand we're at 12:16 already. I am long-winded. I want to just take a moment to talk about two really quick things. That phrase, do the work. I hear people use that phrase all the time, particularly around anti-racism. And it drives me a little mad because of its lack of specificity. But what I've come to understand is that the work is what you choose. You choose anti-racism, and then you choose to improve yourself, and you choose to repair the world, right? And you choose what the work is that you are going to do. So there is no checklist. There's no assignment list. It is not homework, but you may choose to make it so. You may choose a set of books that you want to read, movies you want to see, conversations you want to lead. You get to decide what the work is that you are going to do, so that when you say, I am doing the work, you know what you mean, but nobody else can really define that for you. So the next time somebody asks you, are you ready to do the work? You should say, yeah, here's the work that I'm doing. What else should I do? Also, in all of this, it's very demanding psychically and emotionally to constantly make yourself uncomfortable and getting proximate and making yourself vulnerable and embracing all of that. So take breaks. Binge on Game of Thrones when you have to. It's okay. That's my current binge. But do the thing. Take care of yourself, because you really do need to. And the reason behind that is that this is not a one and done thing at all. This is going to be basically choosing anti-racism, choosing to shore up democracy, choosing to create a better community. This is the work of our lives. It's not the work of 2020. So be in it for the long haul and take the time that you need to care for yourself along the way. Rachel, I went over, but is that okay?
Absolutely. Dan, that was great. We have had some questions come in, so
okay.
We'll start. Starting with the idea of getting proximate, that's being so critical really to civic discourse in addressing community issues. What advice do you have during this time of COVID-19 when to stay proximate is somewhat challenging when you cannot physically come together?
It's a great question. And it's why at the end of every City Club forum since the middle of March, I say something along the lines of like, stay close in your hearts if you can't be close in person. We have to stay in touch with one another. We all have like I think we all have like our little bubbles, right? Our pods, our families, our, really small handfuls of people who we've agreed that some physical contact is okay, but we're all going to continue to try and protect each other along the way. But I think that it requires us to spend a little bit more time tuning in to other people's conversations, seeking out the conversations that are being hosted by other organizations that you may not be familiar with yet, and checking in on, like being a part of them, participating, listening. Last week, a friend of mine who runs an organization called See You at the Top, SYATT, had a conversation about, and she and her sister work in bringing children in from minority communities and people of color to outdoor environments. It started out just getting Black people skiing. And then it's become like, it's expanded into all sorts of other outdoor activities as well. And there's all sorts of reasons behind it, but they were hosting a conversation about that titled "Being Black Outside." Well, that's not necessarily targeted at me, but I tuned in because I wanted to stay close to her and her work and that conversation. So I think that's one of the things that we can do right now. But it's hard. It's really hard. It's a little extra demanding right now. And yeah, I don't have a whole lot more than that though. Sorry. Oh,
there we go.
There you go, Rachel.
Being able to get into discourse with others and have a true civic discourse is going to be engaging with those who have different opinions. But often we might run into those who might not be operating from a place of good faith to have a true discourse and might not necessarily be interested in civility. So how do you navigate that type of conversation?
That's a great question. There is not enough time right now to spend on people who don't actually want to engage in, and like understand one another and try and find common ground. And there's not a lot to be gained in shouting matches, like in the middle of a protest and a counter protest and two people coming together. Every now and then, like you see people who are like, wait, let's have this conversation. But a lot of times it is just anger and shouting. And I think sort of starting out with like asking, like, do you want to engage? Do you want to have a conversation? I'd like to get to understand you. And perhaps you might want to understand where I'm coming from if we want to, lay some groundwork. So you set expectations first. And if they're not interested in that, then that's okay, right? You just can't engage. In the end, you have to make choices about how you engage and with whom. And that's partly to protect yourself, because you don't, your psychic space, your head and your heart, like these are precious. You have to look after them. And really only let in the kind of, this sounds totally hokey, but I spent a lot of time in California. So you can only let in like the energy that is going, that you want to let in, that's going to be beneficial to you. You can't there's a lot of stuff on Twitter and, like people come at me all the time on Twitter. And a friend once said, like, I was really upset about the kind of feedback I was getting one day. And like, and she's like, you can't let them in your attic. Don't let them into your attic. And I think that like you have to, if you are earnest and you want to, and you seek out and you lay the groundwork and you say, here, do you want to have the conversation about the stuff we disagree on? Great. If so, yeah, let's do it. And then you can pull out Eric Liu's, better arguments checklist, right? And if they're like, no, not really, I just want to shout right now, you can be like, great, I'm going to go elsewhere. Enjoy it. That's how I would handle it.
Let's look at an organizational perspective. How do we get better at supporting staff and our community when difficult conversations and decisions are coming at a faster turnaround than ever before? There's very little time often to prepare for those types of conversations.
I think in this environment, and this is I think supported too by some of the research that's been done on work from home and how things have shifted so dramatically in the last 4 months, that the more time you can spend on one-on-one conversations with the people with whom you work most closely or the people who report to you, the better off everybody is going to be. These having a large group meeting like we're doing right now, it can be important for delivering certain pieces of information, but for understanding how people are feeling and what they're facing, you have to have one-on-one conversations. And so for those of us in leadership roles, that means like really shifting what we do and how we do it and putting aside some of the work that we feel we need to get to make time for the people who help us get all of the work done. So I am constantly going back to the importance of these one-on-one check-ins. And by the way, they don't have to be on Zoom or like face-to-face. This format is vitally important and has changed things and made things possible that weren't possible before, but it's also totally exhausting. Let's be honest. And after like 4 hours of Zoom calls, like we all want to just like put our head down on the desk. So if you can shift a Zoom call, a check-in, to a phone call where you're both going for a walk in around your own blocks, like, wouldn't that be nicer? Like, why not? So the one-on-one check-in, ultimately.
So how can one stay close to loved ones that choose the opposite of anti-racism, essentially meaning choosing the status quo?
You know, you know, you can hate the sin and love the sinner is kind of like one way to approach that. But, you know, I think that it's really hard for me to imagine this, this idea that when confronted with this choice, like, are you anti-racist or are you okay with the status quo? And the status quo is like racism, right? And systemic racism and like historically disadvantaged populations of Black and brown people being continued to be disadvantaged, and that you would choose that. Like, it's hard for me to imagine that is a choice that people are willing to make after they've been educated. I tend to think that people who are in that camp, I want to believe that people who are in that camp are just like, they haven't begun their journey yet. And so maybe our job is to help them start their journey by just figuring out the question to ask or the conversation to have, you know, which may come down to like basic values. Like, do you think it's right that some people have, you know, like have advantages that they never earned and other people don't, simply because of the zip code they were born into or the color of their skin? And there's lots of ways that people much smarter than me, you know, have offered to open these conversations. But I think that starting with like the values and that people share as humans, I think that's kind of where you start. And understanding too, like, there are people who are advocating in this moment, like, it's time to, you know, tell your racist uncle that you're not going to come over to his house anymore and he's not welcome at Thanksgiving. And, you know, like, I don't know if I'm there yet and if I'll ever be there. But but you can, you know, the stakes are high, and they should be.
So we are coming up against time, but I do want to ask one more question that takes what you've just talked about to the organizational perspective. Mm-hmm. So thinking about that in a nonprofit setting with board of directors or major gift funders that are in that status quo space, how do you begin that conversation or have those conversations with a board of directors?
So I actually think it's very straightforward, because this is from a what's in it for me point of view for the institution. It's about relevance and an organizational and institutional survival. If you do not, for nonprofits in America today, if you do not understand where you sit with respect to this conversation, you're not going to make it eventually. And for boards of directors who don't understand, there's a lot of tools out there. There's all this training that's being offered that is very affordable, that people should access. The Racial Equity Institute is the one that I talk about the most, because I think it's been the most effective. But I think ultimately for boards of directors, there's a purely sort of financial terms and like fiscal responsibility terms and fiduciary terms. Like, this is where the world is changing and how the world is changing. And we need to, and organizations that survive and thrive in the future are organizations that will embrace this work and understand and be able to articulate how they are doing this, you know, involved in this. And organizations that don't are going to find themselves increasingly marginalized, I suspect. But it's no different than it is in the private sector, right? Like, this is the business case has been made very clear.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts around such a vitally important topic as we continue to navigate such challenges in our community. And we thank you for the time today.